turned it on. Do you have it? Yeah, there's the sound. I'm going to close those doors before we get started. Oh, thanks, Jeremiah. Sorry, let me turn that off. I think we're on, yeah. All right, let's start with the word of prayer and then we'll get started. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study your word. Thank you for the classes that are going on this morning, and thank you that our brethren across the country and around the world are able to meet, and be with those that are not able to meet as freely as we are. Some are still under the threat of persecution, and with that we're thankful that we are able to meet freely here today without that fear, Father. And help us to have clear minds and hearts as we enter into the study of your word. Be with those that are sick and struggling. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Isaiah chapter 60. That's 60. Is where we're going to spend our time. Again, we're just looking at the themes of this book. That's kind of why we're just jumping across chapters. But in this chapter, as we reach Isaiah 60, Isaiah is working toward his conclusion of this book, where he's been writing concerning God's judgment, not only on his people, but we've also seen that there would be other nations who would be judged by God. But what we've also seen in our studies so far is that intertwined in these messages of judgment, there are also messages of hope for God's people. So it's in that context that as we enter into chapter 60 of this great book, we find another message of hope that deals with what verse 1 calls the glory of the Lord. And there in verse 1, the text says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." Now, as we see there in the text, Isaiah is making a point where he's calling his readers to arise and shine. You might say rise and shine, as we sometimes like to say in the mornings, but it goes deeper than that. Now, according to this verse, why should they arise and shine? Their light has come. Now, what does that mean? The light has come. Okay. All right. Right. Yeah, it's more than just the sun rising, but as we've seen in our studies, just with God's judgment coming, they're going through this period of darkness, and that period of darkness is coming to an end. It will come to an end, and so light has come. But the thought doesn't stop there. It also talks about the glory of the Lord having come. Now, can anyone tell me what that idea is about? The glory of the Lord has risen upon you, that phrase. Okay, the Lord has shown favor. So that's definitely part of the idea, but we notice here also that it's paired with this idea of light. So in this context, it is the idea of God having shown favor, but more specifically than that, it's the idea of God's presence among his people, and with the result being that they'd be honored by God. Now, one reason we know the idea of honor here is because that's what that word glory has to do with. It's the idea of honor, but it's applied here to refer to the fact that God's people would be honored by God himself because his presence is now among them. For those who just walked in, we're in Isaiah chapter 60. Anything else on verse 1? All right. So it's this point about the glorification of God's people that Isaiah goes on to deal with in verses 2 through 22 of this chapter. We are going to look at this chapter in its entirety, just kind of survey it, as I'm putting it. But what we find in this chapter are 3 points about the glorification of God's people. The first point we'll see in verses 2 and 3 is that God's people would be glorified through the removal of their darkness. The second point Isaiah makes in verses 4 through 20 is that God's people would be glorified through their return. And finally, the third point Isaiah makes in verses 21 and 22 is that God's people would be glorified through their renewed righteousness. Now, after looking at these things, the application we'll take from these verses is that we too can be glorified by God. So we'll just dive right in. We'll break it down in chunks. We'll just start with verses 2 and 3. The text says, "For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear upon you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." So again, this point that we're going to look at from these two verses is that God's people would be glorified through the removal of their darkness. Now, we've looked at light, we've looked at glory. What is darkness? Okay, that would be spiritual darkness. That is definitely a part of this when you look at the context of Isaiah. So this verse is acknowledging that there is this period of spiritual darkness. But what's going to happen, according to verse 2? And what else does the text say in that last line? And his glory shall be seen, his glory will appear. So it's kind of repeating the ideas of verse 1. It's carrying forward from verse 1, but it's still that idea that even though they're in this period of darkness, there's coming a time when God will come in, his presence will be with his people again, and that idea of glory is repeated. It will appear. Anything else on verse 2? Okay. Now, verse 3 gives a result of what is described in verse 2. What's going to happen in verse 3?
You said nations, but mine says Gentiles.
Okay, and the word nations, another translation you'll find for that is Gentiles, because when you run into this word nations, not only here, but in other passages of Scripture, that is talking about non-Jewish nations. So that's why you'll find Gentiles sometimes. Because that is the term for Gentiles, but it's sometimes translated as nations. But what are these nations going to do, according to verse 3, or the Gentiles?
They are going to come to the light, the brightness of that.
Okay, to what light? Context. To the Lord's glory. So God's going to make his presence among his people, and people are somehow, who are not Jews, are going to see this happening, and they're going to come back. Now, in other chapters of Isaiah that we've seen that people didn't want to have anything to do with God's people because they saw what God's judgment was doing to them. But that situation is going to be reversed when God renews his presence among his people. Questions or comments on verse 3? All right. So putting verses 2 and 3 together, the point we should see about how God's people would be glorified is that God's people would be glorified through the removal of their darkness. Now, in these verses, Isaiah has shown that there's coming a time when God's people would be removed from spiritual darkness through the coming of God and his glory. And the result of that, based on verse 3, is that other nations would see that this is happening, be witness to the fact that God's people are coming out of that spiritual darkness. Now that brings us into the longer point that we see in verses 4 through 20. This is a longer section, but we're going to read it. The text says, there beginning verse 4 of this chapter, "Lift up your eyes round about and see. They all gather together, they come to you. Your sons will come from afar, and your daughters will be carried in the arms. Then you will see and be radiant, and your heart will thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea will be turned to you. The wealth of the nations will come to you. A multitude of camels will cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba will come. They will bring gold and frankincense and will bear good news of the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar will be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth will minister to you. They will go up with acceptance on my altar, and I shall glorify my glorious house. Who are these who fly like a cloud and like the doves to their lattices? Surely the coastlands will wait for me. and the ships of Tarshish will come first, to bring your sons from afar, their silver and their gold with them, for the name of the Lord your God, and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you. Foreigners will build up your walls, and their kings will minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you, and in my favor I have had compassion on you. Your gates will be opened continually. They will not be closed day or night, so that men may bring to you the wealth of the nations, with their kings led in procession. For the nation and the kingdom which will not serve you will perish, and the nations will be utterly ruined. The glory of Lebanon will come to you, the juniper, the box tree, and the cypress together, to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I shall make the place of my feet glorious. The sons of those who afflicted you will come bowing to you, and all those who despised you will bow themselves at the soles of your feet. And they will call you the city of the Lord, the Zion of the Holy One of Israel. Whereas you have been forsaken and hated, with no one passing through, I will make you an everlasting pride, a joy from generation to generation. You will also suck the milk of nations and suck the breast of kings. Then you will know that I, the Lord, am your Savior and your Redeemer, the Mighty One of Jacob. Instead of bronze, I will bring gold, and instead of iron, I will bring silver, and instead of wood, bronze, and instead of stones, iron, and I will make peace your administrators, and righteousness your overseers. Violence will not be heard again in your land, nor devastation or destruction within your borders, but you will call your walls salvation and your gates praise. No longer will you have the sun for light by day, nor for brightness will the moon give you light. But you will have the Lord for an everlasting light, and your God for your glory. Your sun will no longer set, nor will your moon wane, for you will have the Lord for an everlasting light, and the days of your mourning will be over. We'll pause there. So again, these verses we just read are all about God's people returning to the land, and that's why the point is that God's people would be glorified through the return of its people. Now, what's happening there in verse 4? What are God's people to do? To lift up their eyes and see what? Okay, but they'll gather together and to look around and see what they see. But more specifically than that, what they're called to see is how the sons of God's people are returning, and what the text calls their daughters are carried in their arms. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that what Isaiah says here is a statement that refers to the fact that God's people, they're being brought back to the promised land. But who are they being brought back by? By the nations that carried them off. And so that's part of the idea from the context, but then we run into this idea of their daughters being carried in the arms. Now, the word daughters is used there, but what that's a reference to is the fact that even the children are coming back, carried in the arms of their parents. Questions or comments on verse 4? Okay. Verse 5 records for us the response. Now, when they see these things happening, what does verse 5 tell us about the response? They're going to be overjoyed, is the idea there, the thrill and rejoice. Now, according to this verse, what's one reason that they're going to have this response? What's that because statement we read there? Okay, so what picture does that paint? Prosperity. Now, they're not only coming back, but they're also coming back with that prosperity. The wealth of nations is what the text says. So they're coming back. They've been off in captivity under nations, but now they're coming back, not only from that captivity, but they're coming back with some of the wealth of the nations that enslaved them. Anything else on verse 5? All right. Now, verses 6 and 7, we're going to take those together. Again, he's just mentioned some of the wealth that they're coming back with. Verses 6 and 7 give some examples of the wealth that God's people would possess as a result of what has just been described. Now, as we see in the text in verses 6 and 7, Isaiah gives as his examples, they'd come into possession of camels and what appears to be sheep and rams in verse 7. Well, what word do you have, Shauna? Romedaries. I did. Drum. I did not run into that translation. What translation are you reading again? It's King James? Okay, I didn't look at King James in that particular. In verse 6? Okay. Dromedaries would be the young camels. It might be a reference to the young of the camels, because the New American Standard has young camels after camels. So what we're seeing here is a list of animals, but it's not just animals. We also see the gold and frankincense, which is more of the material wealth, the non-animal wealth, for lack of a better term. Okay. Okay. So you said the single-humped camel? Okay. Yeah, it's the single-humped that you'd usually see in that part of the world. Now, when Desiree and I went to Israel, when we saw one of these single-humped camels. It's not the two-humped. We didn't have the opportunity to ride one, but we saw it. So as far as the animals of verse 7, or anything else in verse 6 before we go to verse 7? Okay. Now, as far as the animals of verse 7 are concerned, what Isaiah says in that verse seems to indicate that they will be sacrificed, with the result being that God would glorify his house. And one reason we might be able to assume that, I'll just read the verse again. It says, "All the flocks of Kedar will be gathered together to you. The rams of Nebaioth will minister to you." And after that, the text says, "They will go up with acceptance on my altar." That's sacrifice language. We might be able to assume that. The text doesn't specifically say that, but that is the idea that they would be without blemish, because that's how God wanted the sacrifices to be made. But the result is that he shall glorify his glorious house. Now, another word you might have there, according to this footnote I have, is, or beautify my beautiful house. But again, that's just a side note. But it's the idea that all this is going to be acceptable to God, and it will bring honor to his house, being the temple in the cultural context. Andrea, go ahead. Right. Right. So like Babylon, Assyria, some of the nations that had enslaved God's people. Jeremiah, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, and I have that footnote here. It's the descendants of Kedar, a son of Ishmael, from back in Genesis. So. Right. Yeah. Nebaioth. Yeah. So that's true. Right, because the chosen ones came from the line of Abraham, Isaac. Yeah, Isaac and Jacob. So Ishmael was kind of the half-brother of Isaac. So, but that's a different story altogether. Right. So, anything else on verses 6 and 7? All right. Let's go to verse 8. Verse 8, Isaiah asks a question. He says, "Who are these who fly like a cloud and like the doves to their lattices?" So, as we see in the text, Isaiah is asking a question that asks who these things are, and he compares them to a cloud and doves to their lattices. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that we cannot be 100% certain who or what Isaiah is referring to. One possibility is that it might be angels, but another strong possibility based on verse 9, is that these might be ships with their sails spread, moving quickly across the sea. Now, that brings us into verse 9, where Isaiah answers the question. He's continuing with this idea that God's people are returning. And what does verse 9 tell us? What's mentioned here in verse 9? Who's bringing the people back? The ships of Tarshish. So Isaiah seems to be answering the question of verse 8 about how the coastlands are waiting for God and these ships of Tarshish that are bringing God's people and their wealth with them, all because God has glorified his people. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that these coastlands Isaiah probably has in mind are the coastlands of the land of Israel, right up there against the Mediterranean Sea. And he's picturing these coastlands as waiting for God's people to come back. And the ones bringing them back are these ships of Tarshish. These were ships that were used for transporting things being traded, but here they're being used for bringing God's people back to the promised land and their wealth. Again, that's just what the text says. And the text goes on to give the reason for that. It says, for the name of the Lord your God and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you. So again, God is being honored in his people returning because it's God that has made these things possible. Questions or comments on verses 8 or 9? I know we're moving kind of quickly. But verse 10, Isaiah goes on to make another point, still dealing with the return of the people. And what does verse 10 tell us?
The strangers shall build up their walls, and their kings shall minister to thee.
Okay. So what picture is being painted here in verse 10? Okay. So the Gentiles are going to be helping them in this way to rebuild. Yeah, Jeremiah?
They're not going to be alone in the promised land anymore. When they come back, they will be intertwined with other nations.
That's true.
Not be their land and their land.
That is true. I mean, on that point, we might even argue before they weren't alone before because they didn't completely destroy like God told them to, but it's going to be even more true at this point because these foreigners are going to help them rebuild. And I can't say this for certain, but we might say that some of these foreigners would function as slaves to God's people. So the picture that's being painted here, simply put, is they're going to experience a reversal of circumstances where God's people were slaves, but now these other nations would be enslaved to them. Now again, that's just a possibility we might put forth. The text doesn't say that specifically. But yes, what Jeremiah said is accurate, that they're not going to be completely alone in the promised land. Anything else on verse 10? Okay. So verse 11, the idea of returning and now rebuilding continues. What does verse 11 tell us? About the gates. And what does that mean? They'll be open continually. Day and night. Normally they would shut them at night, but now this verse is painting the picture that they're always going to be open. For what purpose, according to this verse? You have the forces of the nations? Okay. Yeah, the New American Standard has the wealth of the nations. But what does it say about the kings? They're going to be lead in procession. Now, this is talking about the kings of other nations. So this might be also that these kings are going to be brought in as slaves along with the wealth of these other nations being brought in. That's why the gates are going to be open continually, because this is going to keep happening. And the gates will be open for that reason. And Anything else on verse 11? Okay. So going on to verse 12, there's a reason, verse 12 is a reason for what was said in verse 11. What does verse 12 tell us?
The nations and kingdoms that will not serve will perish.
And what does that word perish mean?
Go away.
Go away, but more specifically to be destroyed.
Non-existent.
It paints that picture. Now that shouldn't be taken necessarily literally, but it is, in some ways it is literal. But that word perish has to do with being destroyed. But that needs to be in that context of God bringing his judgment on these nations because they're not serving his people. So other nations and kingdoms would experience God's judgment if they refuse to serve God's people. Now, as
August said they shall be utterly wasted.
yeah, utterly wasted, or mine reads utterly ruined. Now, Isaiah's already talked about that in the book. That's not only God's people that would be judged, but other nations would be judged. And one reason for that is because of what they're doing to God's people. But again, that's in the broader context of Isaiah. Anything else on verse 12? All right. I know we're covering a lot of ground here, but verse 13, Isaiah goes on to list some examples of things that would come to God's people as a result of the things described in verses 10 through 12. And these things that are listed here would come for the purpose of beautifying the place of my sanctuary, the text says, and I shall make the place of my feet glorious. So we have this mention of the place of my sanctuary. Now, from what we know about the history of God's people, especially in the Old Testament, what is the place of his sanctuary? The Holy of Holies. And where was that located? Elaine just said it. In the temple. So all these things that are listed here are being brought back at least partially for the purpose of rebuilding the temple and making it what it once was. But the text also mentions the place of my feet. Now, when you look at the Old Testament, in some contexts, this phrase, the place of my feet, is one way that the Old Testament refers to the city of Jerusalem. It was God's dwelling place. But yes, the sanctuary is temple language, and it's the Holy of Holies, that innermost part of the temple. Anything else on verse 13? All right. Verse 14, we find another point that deals with the nations we've already talked about, but this time they're called the sons of those who afflicted you. Now, what are these individuals going to come doing? You have the word, you have taking the knee there?
They shall come bending unto thee.
Okay. So what is this?
That despise them shall bow themselves down at the soles of thy feet.
So what does that mean? What are these people going to come doing, in other words? Serving. This is service language, submitting themselves to God's people. And it also tells us what they're going to call God's people. And the text says, the city of the Lord, the Zion, or the Holy One of Israel. Now, the city of the Lord is another way that's referring to Jerusalem in this book, and the same is true of the Zion of the Holy One of Israel. Now, we know Zion is where Jerusalem is located, but other nations, as we've said, are going to see what's going on, and they're going to come to recognize what God is doing in restoring his people. But the point being made here is that these people would come serving God because of what's going on, or serving God's people, I should say. Anything else on verse 14? All right, verse 15, Isaiah goes on to make another point that describes how God's people would experience a reversal of circumstances. What does verse 15 tell us?
They've been forgotten and hated,
Now, what else does the verse say?
So that no man went through there.
No man went through there, but what's going to happen? Okay. Okay. So this is where we begin to see the reversal of circumstances. There was a time when people wanted nothing to do with them. These God's people were completely abandoned because of what had happened. But now the circumstances are going to change. They're going to become something to be proud of.
Like you said, the joy of many generations.
A joy from many generations, or from generation to generation. So they were once abandoned and hated by others, but now they would become an eternal source of pride and happiness for all generations. That's what that word joy has to do with, happiness. Anything else on verse 15? All right. Verse 16 goes on to make a point that deals with the fact that there was coming a time when God's people would do what is described here. But in this verse, Isaiah is continuing with an idea already described in the context. God's people would receive from other nations what they had to offer. And in order to make this point, he uses the imagery of sucking milk in breasts like an infant would do, but to make the point that everything God's people would have would come from other nations, but it has its source in God. God is the one who would be doing this for them. But we find some more titles for God. The text says, "And you will know that I am the Lord, am your Savior, and your Redeemer, the Mighty One of Jacob." So we have a list of titles for God. What do those titles have in common? They indicate saving, that God is saving them from the difficult circumstance they were facing by his power. So everything God's people are receiving, it's all because of God and what he's doing for his people in bringing them out of the difficult circumstances they're facing. Anything else on verse 16? Okay, verse 17, we find more examples of what God's people would receive. And it's text says, "Instead of bronze, I will bring gold. Instead of iron, I will bring silver. Instead of wood, bronze. And instead of stones, iron." But that verse concludes with the point being made. It says, "I will make peace your administrators and righteousness your overseers." So we have a list of items that God's people would receive, which would result in the things mentioned in the last two lines of this verse. Now, again, this is a list, and the items on this list have in common with each other is the fact that there are things that would be considered valuable by those who possess them. But what we need to focus on here is this idea of peace being administrators and righteousness being their overseers. So we have overseers and administrators. Reverse those. Well, what are those things, administrators and overseers? Leaders. So the idea here is that peace and righteousness are going to lead God's people. So peace and righteousness, they're parallel terms that refer to being at peace with God as a result of doing what is right and pleasing before God. Questions or comments on verse 17? Okay. So verse 18. Isaiah goes on to say that because of what was described in verse 17, the things listed in the first two lines of these verse would not be heard. Now, according to this verse, what's not going to be heard? Violence. And also devastation, destruction. So these things aren't going to be gone, or aren't going to be happening anymore. That's what I meant to say. And what's the result going to be, according to the last part of that verse? Salvation and praise. But they're going to be looking at the city walls as a source of salvation. Now, this isn't denying the fact that it comes from God, but also as their gates praise, because we've already seen at this point, God is going to allow them to rebuild the city, and they're going to see the things that compose the city, like the city gates and the city walls, as their salvation. Now again, that's not denying that God has made this possible. It's just making a point of how they're going to see their city, its walls, and its gates. Any other questions or comments on verse 18? Okay. Verse 19. What does verse 19 tell us? Oh, can you say that again, Elaine? Okay. That's spiritual, okay. So yes, this is drawing a contrast. The text says that's not these temporary things like the sun and the moon are going to be their light. But as Elaine put it, the Lord's going to be their light. And it's spiritual light, but more specifically, what kind of light does God provide? Everlasting. The sun and the moon eventually, that light's going to end. But the light that comes from God is always there. And that light from God is going to provide them with the glory that Isaiah has mentioned throughout this chapter. Anything else on verse 19? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So, yeah, his light eliminates darkness. And we've already seen that in the context of this chapter, even. Anything else on verse 19? Okay. Now, verse 20 carries forward the sun and moon ideas. And so what Isaiah says here in verse 20 is a point that has to do with the fact that God's people would no longer lose their light because their light now comes from God and their time for mourning will have come to an end. Now, since that's true, something we should know here is that what Isaiah says here continues to emphasize the fact that God's people would continue to rely on him and he'd be a source of joy for them and not the sadness they've been experiencing. So putting verses 4 through 20 together, the point we should see from these verses is that God's people would be glorified through their return. Verses 4 through 20 is all about their return. Now, what Isaiah has also shown is that this glorification would be evidenced in the fact that other nations would serve them and they would receive from nations what they needed. As a result, they'd have a peaceful and righteous existence as a result of their reliance on God and his everlasting light. But we're not done. Let's look at verses 21 and 22, and we'll finish out this chapter. The text says, "Then all your people will be righteous. They will possess the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. The smallest one will become a clan, and the least one a mighty nation. I, the Lord, will hasten it in its time." So this is the last point about the glorification of God's people and that they'd be glorified through their renewed righteousness. Now, what does verse 21 tell us? They'll possess the land forever. Why? Because of their righteousness. Now, what does that word righteousness mean? Right with God. It means right. But yes, in this context, it's right with God. So now that God has made them right, they're coming back into the land and they'll always have it. Now, how is the land described here in verse 21? The work of God's hands. He created it, but he created it for his people. And he's the one who made it possible for them to possess it. And since that's true, God would be glorified or honored. So verse 22 closes out the chapter. What's going to happen in verse 22? What's the text say? And what were you going to say, Elaine? And the least of them will be a mighty nation. And who's going to make it happen? The Lord. So it's this idea that even though God's people will be small in the eyes of others, because God is working, they're going to become a great nation, even though they weren't great before. So putting verses 21 and 22 together, the point we should see from these two verses is that God's people would be glorified through its renewed righteousness. God's people would come back into a right relationship with him. And the result of these things is that they would once again come into possession of the land that God had created for them and become great because of that. So again, there's 3 points about the glorification of God's people in this chapter. They'd be glorified through the removal of their darkness, they'd be glorified through their return, and they'd be glorified through their renewed righteousness. So the application to us in that is that we too can be glorified by God. God does seek to honor us, but if that's going to happen, we need to allow him to remove any darkness from our lives. We need to stand in a right relationship with him. And when that happens, we come to be honored by God, not because of what we have done, but because of what he has done for us. Again, that's just some applications. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Absolutely. Again, it's that reversal of circumstances. Anything else? All right. Matt, will you close us today?